We had just got started for our home audience. We're just reiterating from last week so far. So we just left off on talking about asylum seekers. So yeah, so okay. So in the context, what's different about asylum seekers right now? Because there's been a change. It provides kind of the context for this article. How historically have people treated asylum-seeking populations?
Before, they would be allowed to come in without needing like a bunch of paperwork or any sort of citizenship or proof of residency or anything like that.
Yeah, so asylum seekers were generally just allowed into countries before. And technically speaking, it goes against international law not to do that, according to the UN. Right? It's a human rights violation to require anything from asylum seekers. Why would that be? Why do you think that might be? So if I want to come over to the United States because I want a good job, I have to fill out immigration paperwork, wait for the lottery to pick me, which may or may not ever happen. There's people who wait to come to the United States for decades and never actually come, right? So why is it different for asylum seekers than people who just want a better job?
Well, like with asylum seekers, it's kind of like a more pressing matter that like their life is literally in danger and not that they're just seeking like a better life.
Yeah, it's their life is literally in danger, and if you make them wait, what's probably going to happen? They're going to die. So that's kind of the idea, right? So the idea of asylum is and this is the word asylum comes from people who used to flee to church for protection, right? It's the same concept. You flee to another place. It's an emergency. It's not planned out. You didn't sit around thinking about doing it, right? You're just literally getting out of the way of unrest. What's a colloquialism we use for asylum seekers? We call it? Does anybody know this? Starts with an R. Refugees. So when people talk about refugees, that's what they specifically mean are people who are asylum seekers. Okay. So we are starting to talk about, this article is a review article. It looks at the different themes that are out there in the literature. So really it's just if you think about this is a really precise, longer version of what you do for a term paper, right? You go out and you get a bunch of sources, and then you report back on what you find, right? So essentially that's what this article is doing. This article is just providing us with a summary of what the literature on asylum seeking, right, xenophobia is doing right now. Okay, so the first thing that it pulls out is false beliefs. What did we say about false beliefs so far? Does anybody have anything in their notes? Yeah.
We said that it's mostly spread by government media, and part of the reason why that could be is that it helps drive different political ideas. You might be a hero if you paint this group to be the worst of the worst, and then you say that you're going to instill policies to make sure that they don't come into the country, so then it might make you seem better than the competition. Yeah,
so the literature on false belief is basically saying that asylum seekers become sort of like political pawns in countries, particularly amongst groups that are looking to seize power. And we've seen that a lot in Europe. There's been huge transitions of power in Europe. Parties that didn't even exist prior to the refugee crisis, the Syrian. We talked about the Syrian refugee crisis, right? Last class. Yep. So parties that didn't exist it didn't even exist prior to the refugee crisis. Mostly nationalistic parties. Do people know what that means when I say nationalistic parties? This is kind of an important thing in the world today. Can anybody think of? We have a rise of nationalistic parties worldwide. Can anybody think of examples of what nationalistic parties might have been before? These in different terms. So the previous period where we had a rise in nationalism, it was during the 1930s. in Europe, and what was that called? What were some of the groups that came into power in the 30s? In Europe.
Germany, Italy.
Germany and Italy, yeah. So it's not, you have to be careful, nationalist parties aren't necessarily fascist, right? But there is similarities between them. So we see a rise in nationalist parties, parties that are particularly concerned with closing down borders, getting rid of specific populations, right? And being very hostile towards those groups. Sometimes openly violent towards those groups. Some political parties that came to power during their initial campaigns were doing things like burning refugee camps, right? So like we're talking about very dangerous parties, particularly like in places like Poland and Austria. This is sort of part of the context. We've had a similar shift in the United States, but not as severe, right? But we still see this like rising nationalism, right? So this is sort of the context for that, right? And these parties in particular often use refugee asylum seekers as sort of like pawns to take power. Which is because it actually pairs well with their ideology, because they're usually a little nationalistic, right? That's why they're called nationalist parties. Okay, so how do they portray, so this is on page 25, if you go down to, there's a paragraph that starts, such a model of political, you guys see where that is? And then if you go down a little further, there's a sentence on the far right, starts on the far right, it says this, it's 3 lines down. This is sort of a list of false beliefs that are promoted. Can I get a volunteer to read? Go ahead.
This scholarship has highlighted a range of government and media lies, including the notion that asylum seekers have broken the law by entering the country without prior authorization.
Okay, so just to cover, what's the first one on our list?
That the asylum seekers didn't have the proper authorization to enter a country.
And so what's the problem with that as an idea? Because technically countries can pass, like on their own, laws that say that people need that, right? But what's the problem with that?
Like the UN says that if it's a refugee, they have to be accepted.
Yeah, it's a violation of international law, which we've agreed to. So so when we pass laws that say that asylum seekers need paperwork, essentially what we're doing is we're breaking our own laws to do that. So there's a contradiction there. Okay, continue on.
That asylum seekers are economic migrants, not genuine refugees in need of protection, even though most arrivals go on to receive refugee status.
So, and that means what? So what are refugees usually not here to do?
Get a better life, like a better job.
Yeah, and they're often not here to stay either. Like they're just looking to stay here temporarily until they can go home again, until unrest happens. Most refugees don't want to be in the country that they're in. Has anyone of you ever interacted with somebody who had refugee status? So when I was living in Germany, I actually lived in a Syrian neighborhood and took German classes, most of which were Syrian populations, and they hated being in Germany. They were just very much so just waiting for the first opportunity to go home. And they'd talk about how they didn't like the food, and people weren't particularly warm, and the climate sucked, and they just wanted to leave. Because they didn't want to leave home, right? Which is very different, right? Like if you go and you go someplace to make a better life for yourself, you kind of want to be there. You may not feel that way. And most asylum seekers don't. So they're not here for those reasons. A lot of times people actually had better lives in the places that they left other than the political unrest. So there was somebody I knew who was, he was an adjunct professor at the college where I got my PhD. And he had left Eastern Europe because of a genocide. And he had left Eastern Europe being one of the professors / researchers at one of their flagship schools. So he was one of the premier sociologists in his country. And here he's just teaching part-time, trying to get by, living in a crappy apartment, right? So if you think about the lives of asylum seekers, it's very different from the image of them particularly coming over for those gains, right? That's not what they're doing. Okay, continue.
And asylum seekers are dangerous individuals with terrorist affiliations. Even though most forced migrants are themselves fleeing situations of violence and terror, and few asylum seekers have been convicted of terrorist offenses.
Yeah, so asylum seekers generally haven't committed acts of terrorism. We portray them as something different in the United States. What do we have a tendency to portray asylum seekers are in a negative way? In particular, I'm thinking about, does anybody know what in recent years, the controversy in the United States over asylum seekers, what population that dealt with? Who we have in camps on our borders right now? You may know what population it is? They're Guatemalan refugees. So you guys know about the camps on the border, right? Like this isn't, people are aware of this. So right now we have, I'm not sure, at least thousands of people who are asylum seekers detained at our borders. And they are, in essence, just being held in place. A lot of them are not getting medical care, so if they're injured or if they have some sort of chronic illness, they're just dying there. A lot of times the population isn't really being fed, so they're being underfed, and there's all sorts of issues, right? So this is essentially what's happening on our border right now. It's not happening on the same scale as Europe. So when we're talking about Europe, it's because it's in some ways a bigger deal in Europe. But it's so, it's still a big deal here. And so how does anyone aware of how we portrayed Guatemalan refugees? What were we claiming that they were in the United States? We were claiming that they were drug dealers, right? So that was kind of the claim, but it's the same lines, right? In the same way that like most of the Guatemalan refugees were not coming over because they were part of Mexican drug cartels. First of all, they're not from Mexico, But then also like in the same way, right? Like in Europe, they painted them as terrorists, even though they weren't. They're usually populations that aren't very politically aligned with terrorist groups, or they wouldn't be asylum seekers, right? They wouldn't be refugees. So anyways, that's going on. And then after that, after this list, it talks about the communicative function of political action. What does it communicate to the population to hold asylum seekers at the border in detention? That they are what? Dangerous, right? So in the same way that in essence, this literature would want to claim that that's essentially like what's happening is that we're portraying them in a certain way, reinforcing these false beliefs to create hostility towards them. Okay, so that's our first one. Our second theme is on page 26, and this is the idea of new racism. So this literature, we talked about otherness before. You guys remember this? When we started the week on racism, we talked about otherness. The other. We talked about difference. Do you guys remember this? Talked about race, ethnicity, and difference. Other is the language of difference, right? So like when you have an other, it's a group of people that you understand your identity in contrast to. Right? So you understand yourself as the opposite of another group, and we refer to this group as groups that fulfill this as other, right? So masculinity is often defined as the opposite of femininity, right? White is defined as the opposite of black, right? Poor is the opposite of rich, right? So, and this would be the language that sociologists often use, hegemonic identities, identities that dominate politically and economically, understand themselves in contrast, right, to other groups of people. You guys follow that? Yes, no, did I get too abstract? Just making sure. Silence can mean that everybody understands everything, and it also can mean that like nobody understood anything. So, okay, so I'm going to draw our attention to if you're following along this second paragraph here, where it says, starts with scholars, I'm going to jump down to the paragraph, the sentence below that that reads from. I'm going to get a different volunteer to read.
Where did you want this to start?
Oh, it's so on page 26, underneath the title where the paragraph that says scholars, I'm going to jump down to the sentence that starts with from. It's 2 lines down.
From this perspective, asylum seekers with different skin colors have been interpreted as a threat to the national self. Writing in the European context, for instance, Lincoln Smith note that blackness and criminality have become conflated such that people of color are forced to inhabit the figure of the illegal alien, the enemy outsider, the welfare sponger, and drug dealer, and the deceased body. In this panoptic theater of race, they argue the figure of the black terrorist criminal is commonly on sight.
Okay, so what's that say? What's so how does our national identity, if we're thinking racially, right? What is the national identity of Europeans or Americans? What is that almost unilaterally going to be defined as? What group of people? It's going to be defined as white people. Well, we can get even more narrow. What particular groups of white people? We talked about with, you know, the blackface, right? Not all groups of white people are considered the same in the United States.
Rich white people.
Yeah, in essence, like our national identity is middle class white people. Like it's sort of like our national identity is that sort of suburbanite culture, right? And so what does the intrusion of people into Europe or what, what, are we equally afraid of all people who immigrate to the United States? What population aren't we particularly concerned about when they come over here? Oh, so yeah, there is some difference in like, we could talk about in terms of racial groups, like people from Southeast Asia are often treated different than people from like Africa or people from South America. That's totally true. What other groups are we often not concerned about if they immigrate here? Yeah, I've never heard, my grandma is really prejudiced against Canadians, but I think it's because we live on the Canadian border, you know, so it's basically, but she always complains that they come over and they buy stuff at our grocery stores, which is just a weird thing that my grandma's like almost 90, so like, anyways, but getting back to the point, like, yeah, so like we're not concerned if Canadians migrate to the United States. Is there a lot of like outcry about people from Europe moving to the United States? No. But who do we get really upset about moving into the United States? Yeah, basically, so like if we think about it, we form a white national self, which isn't really indicative of our population, right? It's just what we identify as being American. And then any group essentially like that comes over from other racial groups, we view this as a threat to ourselves. But how do we code it? How do we talk about it? We're afraid of what changing? What are we afraid of changing from immigration? Or what? Because most people in the United States are concerned about immigration. They're unhappy about it. What are we afraid of changing at a national level? How do people talk about it? Yeah, the language is that it's going to change our culture. It gets framed as culture rather than race. Actually, like in general, and thinking back to ideas of colorblind racism, culture often becomes a proxy for race, right? So when people talk about being afraid of their culture changing, it's telling that like if somebody moves here from Scandinavia, we're not like, oh, Scandinavians are going to change our culture. Right? But if somebody comes over from a Spanish-speaking part of the world, we are afraid of that, right? And so basically, like, it becomes this newer form of racism, this sort of, and this fits in, like, it's a polite form of racism. If you look on page 27, there's a paragraph here that kind of lists the qualities of what this literature is calling new racism, right? And it actually parallels pretty closely to what we were talking about for colorblind racism, right? First, it avoids making reference to biology. It's not talking about people's skin color. It talks about culture. Second, it often involves appeals to fact, right? So a lot of times hostility towards immigrant populations talk about the poverty of other countries, how violent other countries are, right? These are the things that they're afraid of. It's no longer just sort of this emotional, I don't think it's right. Old school racism is often framed in an emotive way, right? Like, I'm uncomfortable with, right? New racism is often framed in what is portrayed in factual terms, and our author has fact there in scare quotes. Finally, new racism often involves verbal disclaimers that one is not being racist when they say it, right? I've got nothing against. You know, I don't care if, right? And then, you know, has anyone ever heard, this is a common phrase, anything before the word but is meaningless? Right? And I think that's kind of the feeling like that they're trying to bring out, is that often when we talk in terms of when we talk in ways that are racist in newer ways, right, we often qualify our statements, but that qualification is just to shed doubt on whether we're being inappropriate, right? Okay, so that's our second theme. Our third theme is sociobiological, sociobiology. Does anybody know, anybody recognize a word in here?
Biology.
Biology. So what do you think sociobiology is?
The study of something.
We should be getting used to this word, part of the word too. Essentially, sociobiology is the spot where biological explanations and sociological explanations meet. Right? There's a long history of sociology being very uncomfortable with biology. Our author sort of indicates this a little bit too. And that's because of the history of racism, right? Sociobiological explanations were very common under scientific racism. So basically when people there's sort of a pseudoscience of race that happened in the 19th century and into the 20th century that served as a lot of foundations of our racial ideologies. So sociology became very uncomfortable with biology. But in just like the last 15 years, they talk about biology differently, and biology has sort of come into play again in sociology. A big chunk of this has to do with that traits are triggers. Traits have to be triggered. So in sort of old school scientific racism, it was just that we had genes and there's difference in genes determine difference in behavior. Sociobiology is more like people have biological behaviors that are triggered in certain circumstances. So it's the study of basically like what are these sort of biological imperatives and how do they get triggered. Does this make sense? Did you catch what the biological mechanism is that gets triggered, how it gets triggered in this section? Let me see this. I gave a page number for this, right? Or no? Page 28 is where this discussion starts. What do people, according to this literature, what do people do biologically? What's somewhat natural for people to do? Why do they do it?
It's like competition between groups, because in like evolution they wanted the best to survive, and so there was always like separation between like the way that groups related to each other and how likely they were to move on to the next generation.
Yeah, so there's a biologically there's a group, people are group oriented, right? And that sometimes they're in conflict with other groups. But we're not always group oriented, right? Like sometimes we're open, sometimes we're not. Does anybody catch what the trigger is? What causes people to become group oriented? We can think about this. I think we could almost like take this as an assumption. When do you think people will pull strongest to the groups they belong to? When they feel what? What do you think? Well, what points in your life? So, you guys have. How many of you plan on like staying moved away from your family now that you're moved away? Anybody in here?
You said plan on staying away?
Yeah, anybody planning on, moving away, living in different parts of the country, doing whatever? Okay, what sort of things in your life do you think might cause you to go back to your family if you're living away?
Someone getting sick. Like my parent getting sick.
So you could be that we have certain responsibilities. What else?
Weddings, funerals.
What's that?
I said weddings or funerals or like things like that.
Oh yeah, like short trips. What about like what might make you move back home?
You need money.
You need money.
Yeah.
Something goes wrong in your life, right? Like, you essentially, like the idea is that our group orientation is often triggered by things like fear, right? Fear of the unknown, uncertainty, that these things are sort of like triggers, right, that cause our group orientation. So if a population feels fearful, or if they feel like they're in danger, they're more likely to become more group oriented, more inclusive, more exclusive, right? They pull to the in-group, they exclude the out-group. Make sense? Okay, so just thinking about it, how does that tie in with what we've already talked about? So this middling part is going to tie into both the literatures that come before it and after in this article. How could this tie in with what we were talking about with like the false belief section in particular? What do you think?
Like with the false beliefs, like we talked about how like the government usually like spreads that like they're dangerous or like we should be afraid of them. So that could be like the people who are originally from that country. So like Americans, like everyone that was born here, would be like group orientated from like the fear of like the dangerous refugees coming into our country.
Yeah, so false beliefs essentially can kind of provide a false trigger. It's trying to get people to be fearful, right? And that's how the author in the conclusion is going to frame that literature, that you can tie these literatures together, that they're interrelated, because essentially like fear is a mechanism to do that. And you can think about too, like if we were to go back to other moments where countries became really nationalistic and group oriented, often this revolved around fear, right? So like if you're talking about Europe in the 30s, right, Benito Mussolini talked about a lot about stateless populations, because after World War I there was whole populations that didn't belong to any country, and being fearful of these stateless populations and their impact, right? In the same way as many of us, like all of us in the room I'm sure know, like anti-Semitism was used as sort of like the leaping off point for Nazism in Germany, right? And often when you get nationalistic politics, you're going to get fear. Right now you get, there's a lot of rise of nationalism in Southeast Asia too, and often this has to do with creating fear towards specific populations, usually Muslims, Muslim groups within their own country, right? So this is where you kind of interrelate that. Okay, there's one last thing, which ties in pretty closely to some of the stuff we talked about for inequality a couple weeks ago. So this theme starts on page 30. So when we were talking about growing inequality worldwide, we were talking about basically like, in some ways like things like when we were talking about like austerity, right, and the cutting of government services, what this all relates to is that our lives are often pervaded by more risk, right? There's an increase in risk. This is, the literature on this is referred to as, very often refers to it as precarity. Make sure it's still right. Precarity. So the literature on this often talks about precarity, that we often live, you know, now often people are living with less savings. People are living with, and this is true in the United States too, right? We live on with less savings. Our work, you're more likely, most of you guys will change careers 3 to 5 times in your life now, right? You think about like, you know, you go back a couple of generations and people would work for at a place, even if it wasn't like that great of a job, they'd work there for 40 years and then they'd retire from it, right? And then they would have a pension. Like, you're more likely to not have much of a savings, control your, change careers 3 to 5 times, and not really have retirement saved up, right? That's the trend that's happening. What is that an example of? It's an example of this increasing risk structure. We're going to look later in the week at the gig economy for our sex worker article. I'm sure you guys have read that by now, but you know, and it's always the same thing, right? Like our lives become more precarious within that way of running an economy. So our authors are also tying, there's also a whole literature tying this to this fear, right, towards asylum seekers. They're tied up in this sort of like new racism that's constructed by a fear of this sort of national invader, right, is in a lot of ways tied in with this sort of like latent fear that pervades our lives as we become more insecure. Which we could also tie to this sociobiological. So the point of the author's making is that there's several different like strands of literature, but they're actually in a lot of ways talking about the same thing, which is that we have a rising xenophobia as a result of the fear constructed in our lives, right? Which in some ways are being actively produced, according to our author, right, by governments who both promote an ideology of fear, as well as have policies that actually make our lives more unstable, right? So that's the idea. Did you?
No, I'm just.
Okay. Anybody have any comments or thoughts on this? Ideas? No, we'll move on to gender. Okay, cool. Well, that ends our discussion of race and ethnicity. Okay, so this week is our week on gender. And there's a few things we should get done. So one thing we should understand is the difference between some terms, what we mean by them. And then also, before we leap into the articles, I want to give kind of a quick and dirty like explanation of feminism and what feminism is and what the different camps within feminism are. Because gender studies is dominated by feminist literature. So it is the most common form of literature in the sociology of gender. Okay. Sex versus gender. What is biological sex? Does this refer to? This is sex not as a verb, but as a noun. So you don't have to feel so comfortable giving an answer. Yeah.
Like based off of reproductive organs?
Yeah, people are born with specific reproductive organs, right? So what are the options, I guess, in terms of sex?
Male and female.
You have male. Female, right? What else do you have? It's the third. You can be intersexed, which is when you have both parts. It's rare, right? But it is something that people have. So, in terms of biological sex, right? That's what you have. Those are essentially your options, if you will. So your biological sex is different from gender. Gender is the cultural meaning we place on sex. So it's the cultural meaning that we place on sex. So, starting real simple, what are the categories for gender? It's a bit of a trick question. It depends on what culture you belong to. Right? There are vastly different ways of understanding sexual difference at a cultural level. So sometimes cultures have middling sexes. You know, there are hundreds of these across the world. Most of them have disappeared since. We have a binary system of gender, which also doesn't actually completely describe sex, right? Historically, at least in the US and Europe, you have binary gender system. So on one level, the gender system divides out how we understand sex. Another thing that the gender system does, which is maybe more important to sociologists, is it prescribes roles, right? It prescribes gender roles. And these are fluid and change over time. So, and I'll ask you, so like in the United States today, which of the genders is usually in charge or thought of as the better person to be in charge of child rearing? Has this always been true even in the West? In the 18th century, it was generally considered better for men to rear children, right? Especially amongst wealthier classes, that males should shape children. Now, of course, it was disparaging towards women, because it was generally because people thought that women were too irrational to do it correctly, or weren't stern enough. But the gender system changes, right? Or we could think about too, like things like which is the attractive sex traditionally in Western culture? Which sex is considered more attractive or beautiful? The female sex, which is not true if you're like in ancient Greece, where generally females in a very like sexist way were thought of as quite unattractive. This is why there's so many statues of naked men and so few of naked women. So the point is that regardless of what individual item we can think of that we usually ascribe to sex differences, whether it's clothing, whether it's dress, whether it's what women are good at, what women are bad at, if we look hard enough, we will find individual cultures whose gender system completely negates them, right? So the point is like sex does have an influence, right? But it's not always the influence we like to ascribe, right? And then often it can be overcome. Does it make sense? So like a good way to think of it, so has anybody here taken a psychology class? So in psychology, people talk about this idea of nature versus nurture. It's a good point to point out in sociology it works different. The nature versus nurture debate. Right? And what's the nature versus nurture debate? You take an individual behavior and you ask what?
Is it just like how they are naturally, or is it like how they were raised?
Yeah, so in psychology, is it how they were born, right? Is it in their biology? Or is it how they were raised? Right? In sociology, we have a tendency not to think of these things as opposites, but actually as interrelated things. I think you can see this in gender a lot, right? So like, we are given a set of biological imperatives, right? But those things have no meaning. The way in which we're raised can reinforce them or it can negate them, right? And both happen all the time, right? Another way to think about it is if I'm capable of doing something, regardless of what it is, am I biologically capable of doing it? Yeah, obviously if I did it, I'm biologically capable of doing it. Am I culturally capable of doing it? Yeah, both of these things are things that we don't control. They're not agency, they're not choices, right? They are things that exert influence on us from the outside. It's whatever, so if we think about it, like all of our actions are actually more like a nuanced combination of both influences, right? So sociology have a tendency to think of it as more like both are influencing us, but this is the one that we have a tendency to study, right? Our methods in sociology are particularly well attuned to understanding how we're enculturated. They're not as good for understanding our biologists. We're willing to defer to biologists on those things, right? But we shouldn't understand these as separate things, right? Unrelated, or like things that work against each other. Everything involves both. Because we always use our bodies for everything we do, right? And so in the same way, we think about sex and gender, right? And these are both influences. And they mutually reinforce each other. Okay. One last, just to get terms down. So gender is different from gender identity or sexual orientation. Because we sometimes get a little confused just on these terms. So if gender is our cultural system, right? We have all sorts of categories of gender depending upon which system we live in. You know, the classic example is Native Americans. Sometimes it's referred to as two-spirited, right? There are these people who fall in between sex. Okay, so what is gender identity? People know what this term means. What is a person's gendered identity? Have people heard this term before? I'm just looking for a guess.
Like the sex that you identify with.
It's not even the sex you identify with. It's what gender you identify with within the gender system, right? So individuals identify with specific genders, right? This is not the same as a gendered system, right? So you can you could be born into a sex of being female, right? There is a gender narrative of what men are. You may identify with the gender narrative of what men are, even if, right? Do you guys see how that works? So there is a distinction to be made here between this is, if you want to think about it, this is prescriptive, and it's the framework you live in, right? So this is culturally prescriptive. So this isn't an individual, like, the gender system is not an individual choice. It's just the framework you live in, right? This is when we start getting into individualized things. Make sense? So like you may not really identify with your gender role, right? But the gender role is what it is. Like the expectation of how men and women act, right? That comes from our gender system. Okay, lastly, sexual orientation. What's sexual orientation? Just looking for guesses. It's a very common term. Yeah.
Like who you're attracted
It's just who you're attracted to, right? Which once again, like, I think it's easier if you think of these things as separate phenomena, right? We're going to focus mostly on gender, right? So this is the area that we're going to focus on this week. And so, okay, so when we come back to class, we'll talk about feminism on Wednesday. Okay. Have a good day, guys.